I'm David, miles away from home, out here in the middle of nowhere, just the way I like it. There's something about the quiet out here, the kind you only find in places far from people, that clears my head. No phone signal, no traffic, no noise. Just me and the landscape stretching out in every direction. So I'd set out on a solo hiking trip through the quiet countryside trails I'd found online. The paths were well marked, winding through serene forests and golden meadows. It was everything I had hoped for. Peaceful and refreshing, the perfect antidote to the stress I had left behind. As I followed the familiar route, the sunlight filtering through the trees, I came across something strange. A small wooden sign stood off to the side, nearly hidden by the undergrowth. It pointed down a narrow path that wasn't listed on my map. I should have stayed on the main trail, but curiosity got the better of me. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered, something the map had deliberately left out. The path started easy enough, thin but manageable. The trees closed in the further I went, their branches stretching overhead to form a canopy, blocking out the sun. I told myself it was just another part of the forest, nothing to worry about. But as the trail narrowed and the light dimmed, I began to feel uneasy. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I was just starting to think about turning back when he appeared. Out of nowhere, a bearded man lunged at me from the shadows, his wild eyes glinting with something dark and dangerous. I barely had time to react before he swung at me, his fist connecting hard with my arm. The impact sent me stumbling backward, pain shooting through my arm as I tried to regain my balance. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who was this man? Why had he attacked me? There was no time to think. Instinct took over, and I turned and bolted, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't care where I was running. I just knew I had to get away from him. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps pounding against the forest floor, but I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed endless as I ran, branches whipping against my face and arms. My lungs burned, and every step felt heavier than the last, but I couldn't stop. The pain in my arm was a distant ache now, overshadowed by the sheer panic driving me forward. I could still hear him behind me, the sound of his feet crashing through the undergrowth. I tried to stay focused, dodging low branches and roots, but the fear made it hard to think straight. I knew that if I tripped or slowed down, he would catch me. After what felt like hours, the forest began to thin, and the light brightened as I neared safer ground. The man's footsteps grew fainter, and then, just like that, they were gone. I kept running until I was certain I was alone, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something darker, waiting on that hidden trail. Even after I made it back to the safety of the main trail, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the strange path. The image of his wild eyes burned in my mind, and every time I flexed my aching arm, the memory of his attack came rushing back. I should have let it go. I could have walked away, finished my hike, and never looked back. But something inside me wouldn't let me. There were too many questions. Why was that trail hidden? What was that man doing out there? And most importantly, what was he trying to keep me from finding? The only way to find out was to return, under cover of darkness. If I went back at night, I might be able to explore the path without being noticed. It was risky, I knew that. But curiosity gnawed at me, and before I could talk myself out of it, I made up my mind. That night, as the forest lay cloaked in shadows, I crept back toward the hidden trail. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under my boots, felt louder in the silence. The cool night air wrapped around me like a warning, but I kept going, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The narrow path felt even more sinister in the dark, the trees pressing closer than I remembered. But I pushed forward, every step taking me deeper into the unknown. And then, just when I was beginning to doubt whether the trail would lead anywhere, the forest opened into a small clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a hovel, barely standing, with slanted walls and a sagging roof. A dim light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Whatever was hidden inside that shack, I knew it wasn't good. As I crept toward the hovel, every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I was too far in now, too curious, too determined to uncover the truth. The closer I got, the more I could hear, faint murmurs, the sound of soft, desperate breaths coming from within. I reached a cracked window, the dirty glass giving me a glimpse inside. My breath caught in my throat. There, huddled together in the dim interior, were several people, men and women, their clothes tattered and their faces gaunt. Their eyes, wide and fearful, flicked toward every sound outside, as if they were waiting for something terrible to happen. They looked exhausted, drained of hope. It was clear they were being held against their will. Whatever they had endured in this place, it had broken something inside them. My stomach churned at the sight, but I knew I couldn't leave them there. I crouched low and made my way to the door, careful not to make a sound. My hand hovered over the latch, heart pounding, as I prepared to open it and set them free. Just as my fingers touched the door handle, a noise behind me sent a jolt of fear through my body. I spun around, and there he was, the bearded man, emerging from the shadows as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a rage so fierce it made my blood run cold. In his hand, he gripped a long, rusted iron rod. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His intent was clear in the way he moved, closing the distance between us with terrifying calm. Adrenaline surged through me, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The night exploded into motion, the forest becoming a blur as I sprinted back the way I had come. I could hear the man behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The iron rod whistled through the air as he swung it, barely missing me as I dove into the undergrowth. My lungs burned and my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The forest seemed to twist and tangle around me, branches slapping against my face, roots snagging at my boots. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see the bearded man's dark shape, moving relentlessly through the trees. I knew the forest better now, and I used every trick I could think of, doubling back, slipping through dense patches of brush, ducking behind trees, to put distance between us. The chase was relentless, but slowly I began to gain ground. The forest thinned, and I caught sight of the main trail up ahead. I pushed harder, forcing my body beyond its limits, until finally I broke free from the undergrowth and stumbled onto the open path. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I kept running until the forest was a distant shadow behind me. When I reached the safety of the town, I made my way straight to the police station. The officers listened carefully as I explained everything: the hidden trail, the hovel, the people trapped inside, and the bearded man who had attacked me. My words came out in a frantic rush, but they didn't question me. They could see the fear in my eyes, the urgency in my voice. The police wasted no time organizing a search party. With their flashlights cutting through the night, we made our way back into the forest, following the path I had taken earlier. The trail was even more eerie under their lights, but I pressed on, determined to lead them to the clearing. When we reached the hovel, the officers moved quickly, breaking open the door and freeing the captives inside. Their faces, filled with exhaustion and fear, brightened slightly at the sight of their rescuers. I watched as they were led out into the fresh air, their ordeal finally over. The bearded man wasn't far. The police found him hiding in the undergrowth, not far from the clearing, his iron rod still clutched in his hand. He didn't resist as they took him into custody, his eyes dull and empty, as if the fight had drained out of him. The weight of the week lifted as I drove along the dark, winding roads leading out of town. Tonight was meant to be an escape, a chance to unwind, have a drink, and maybe meet someone interesting. I had heard about this bar on the outskirts, quiet, with good music, and not too crowded. It seemed perfect for the kind of night I needed. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how still everything felt. The few streetlights scattered around barely pierced the darkness, casting weak halos on the cracked asphalt. There were only a handful of other cars in the lot, most of them parked near the bar's entrance. I found a spot farther out, preferring the isolation, even though it meant a longer walk. When I stepped out of my car, The sound of my shoes hitting the pavement felt louder than usual, each step echoing in the silent night. I took a deep breath, relishing the coolness in the air. It was strange how quiet it was, no music drifting from the bar, no distant hum of conversation. But it didn't bother me at first. I locked my car, and just as I was about to head inside, someone called out. The voice came from behind me, faint but urgent. I turned to see a man jogging toward me, a wiry figure with wide eyes, short in stature, and clearly out of breath. As he reached me, his face twisted into a strange mix of fear and exhaustion. "Hey man, thank God, I need your help." His voice wavered, barely masking a hint of panic. "There's a kid around the corner in trouble, please." My mind stumbled over his words. A kid? Here? In this desolate, quiet place? The logical part of me wanted to brush him off, maybe tell him to find someone else. But something stopped me. What if he was telling the truth? What if there really was a child in danger? I hesitated, weighing my options. The man's breathing was shallow, like he'd run a long way to find help. I knew it might be safer to ignore him, but something about the way he looked, desperate, frantic, kept me rooted to the spot. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "All right, show me where." Without wasting a second, the man spun on his heel and motioned for me to follow. His urgency seemed genuine, and before I could think better of it, I fell into step behind him. He led me around the side of the bar, where the lights thinned out and shadows stretched long across the pavement. A narrow alleyway emerged ahead, lined with graffiti-covered walls and old dumpsters that reeked of stale beer. It felt colder here, as if the air carried a warning I didn't fully understand. I told myself to focus. If there was a kid in trouble, there was no time to waste. The man glanced back over his shoulder once or twice, his pace quickening. The streetlights from the parking lot faded, leaving only dim slivers of light bouncing off the metal dumpsters. My footsteps slowed, a knot forming in my stomach. Something felt wrong, too quiet, too planned. But before I could react, a figure stepped out of the darkness ahead. He was taller and broader than the first man, his face hidden by the low light. There was no hesitation as he closed the distance between us, his hand shooting out to grab my arm. His grip was like iron, crushing and unforgiving. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pulled back, trying to free myself from his hold. The moment his hand clamped down on me, instinct took over. I yanked, twisted, and threw my weight in the opposite direction, desperate to break free. His grip didn't falter, but I felt something, just a slight slack in his hold. Summoning every bit of strength I had, I jerked my arm again, harder this time. With a burst of adrenaline, I slipped free. I didn't think. I ran. The alley blurred as I sprinted back toward the parking lot, my only thought to get away, to reach the light. But the ground betrayed me. My foot hit a loose brick, and before I knew it, I was airborne, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. Pain shot through my side as I hit the pavement hard, the air knocked from my lungs. I scrambled to get up, but it was too late. Hands grabbed me, 2 pairs this time. The short man and the tall man worked in unison, each gripping an arm and hauling me to my feet. I kicked wildly, my shouts echoing off the walls, but they didn't care. They dragged me deeper into the alley, the light from the parking lot shrinking behind me. Fear wrapped around me, sharp and suffocating. I twisted, kicked, shouted, anything to get free, but their grip only tightened. I could feel the hopelessness creeping in, thick and suffocating. This wasn't random. They had planned this. I was being taken somewhere, and I didn't know if I'd make it back. My muscles burned as I fought against them, but the men were relentless. They yanked me forward with brutal efficiency, their grip unyielding. Each step deeper into the alley made the world outside feel more distant, like I was slipping out of reality, further from any chance of rescue. I tried planting my feet on the ground, twisting my arms, but they only adjusted their grip, dragging me like dead weight. The air in the alley felt different, colder, heavier, and with each passing second, I could feel hope slipping away. My shouts felt useless, swallowed by the thick shadows pressing in from all sides. I kicked harder, desperate for any opening, but their hands held tight. Every movement I made seemed to fuel their determination, as if they knew exactly how to handle someone like me. We moved deeper into the narrow passage, the walls closing in, dumpsters on either side blocking any clear exit. Panic clawed at my mind, making it hard to think. I couldn't let them take me further. Something bad would happen if I did, something worse than I could imagine. But no one was coming. It was just me and them in the suffocating blackness of the alley. And then, in the midst of my struggle, I shouted one last time, a scream that tore through my throat with every ounce of strength I had left. At first, I thought the silence would be my only answer, but then I heard it. Voices. Faint but unmistakable. My scream had reached someone. I thrashed harder, emboldened by the possibility of rescue. "Hey, you hear that?" A voice called out, growing closer. My attackers faltered, their steps slowing for the first time since they'd grabbed me. I twisted my head, trying to see who was coming. Two figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, just shadows at first, but real, solid people moving toward us. Their voices were sharp, demanding, cutting through the night. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" One of the men shouted, his words edged with anger. My captors hesitated, the short one looking over at the tall man with a flicker of panic in his eyes. They hadn't expected this. They had counted on the isolation, the silence of the night working in their favor. Now, confronted with two angry strangers, they knew their plan was falling apart. The grip on my arm slackened, and without another word, the two men let go. I hit the ground, gasping for breath, and rolled to my side, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The two men who had dragged me so far into the alley now exchanged a quick, silent glance before making a decision. They ran, fading into the darkness of the alley like shadows retreating from the light. Their footsteps echoed once, twice, and then vanished completely. For a moment, everything was still. The alley was quiet again, just as it had been when I first arrived. I lay on the ground, disoriented and shaking, trying to steady my breathing. The two men who had come to my aid rushed toward me, their faces etched with concern. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, crouching beside me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I really was. The fear still clung to me, but the immediate danger was gone. The two strangers helped me to my feet, steadying me as I wobbled. The alley seemed longer now, the shadows deeper, as we made our way back toward the parking lot. The streetlights, though dim, felt like a beacon guiding me away from the darkness I'd just escaped. "We'll call the cops," one of the men said, his voice firm but reassuring. "They need to check this area out." I nodded, grateful but still numb. The gas station convenience store was my world for the graveyard shift, a small bubble where nothing much happened. I worked these hours for the solitude, drawn to the slow hum of the refrigerators and the glow of the fluorescent lights overhead. Most nights, only truckers and commuters stopped by, and I liked it that way. Predictable, quiet. I could stand behind the counter, sipping bad coffee, and let the hours dissolve into a steady rhythm. That night started off the same way. I leaned against the counter, listening to the clock tick toward midnight. Outside, the parking lot was empty, bathed in the cold wash of yellow light from the overhead lamps. Occasionally, a breeze swept through the automatic doors, bringing in the scent of asphalt and gasoline. It was routine, uneventful, and exactly the way I liked it, until it wasn't. The door chimed, and I glanced up, expecting a trucker, or maybe someone passing through town. But instead, a woman stumbled inside, and everything about her screamed trouble. Her clothes were filthy, torn at the edges, and her eyes were wide with something between fear and exhaustion. She clutched her sides as if holding herself together, and her gaze darted around the store like she was expecting someone to burst in at any second. It wasn't the kind of entrance I was used to seeing. She looked desperate, almost feral. "Please help me," she whispered, barely able to speak through gasps. "My name is Victoria. I escaped. They were holding me. Two men, people I knew. They changed. Something just snapped. They're coming for me." I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy working the night shift, waiting for morning to come. But the fear in her voice was raw, and I couldn't ignore it. Without thinking too hard, I motioned her behind the counter. "Stay low. Don't move. I'll figure something out." She slipped into the cramped space behind the counter, curling up against the shelves of cigarette cartons. Her breathing was shallow, and I could tell she was trying not to cry. I stayed standing, fighting the urge to panic. The fear was contagious, creeping in the way the cold air does when the heat's turned off. The door chimed again, and my heart nearly stopped. Two men entered, exactly how she had described them. They looked rough, like they had been out all night, their clothes rumpled, and their eyes sharp. One of them had a scar running from his temple to his jawline, giving him a permanent sneer. The other was wiry, twitchy, his gaze flitting across the store like a spotlight. I stood behind the counter, trying to seem casual, though my hands were clammy. They approached slowly, the scarred one leaning over the counter. His voice was low, threatening without even trying. "We're looking for someone. A woman. You seen her?" I shook my head, forcing a shrug. "Nobody's come in for hours." His eyes didn't leave mine. It felt like he was measuring my words, weighing them to see if they held any truth. The twitchy one wandered off, checking the bathroom and the aisles, his movements jerky, impatient. The scarred man stayed close, watching me like a predator deciding whether to pounce. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to keep my breath steady. My heart hammered against my ribs, and every second felt like an hour. They opened every door, peeked behind every corner. For a moment, I thought they would look behind the counter and find her. But then, as if some unseen signal passed between them, they gave up. The scarred man stepped back, his sneer deepening. "If you see her, you let us know," he said, his words thick with unspoken threats. They turned and left, the door chiming as it closed behind them. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave my body, though the fear stayed lodged deep in my chest. Victoria was still curled up behind the counter, her wide eyes locked on me. "They're gone," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For a moment we just stayed there, both of us catching our breath. I knew I should call the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she had begged for help, like she was afraid the cops couldn't protect her. Or maybe I was just afraid the men would come back before the police arrived, and things would get even worse. We had a brief window, a chance to act before they returned. "We need to figure out a way to get you out of here," I whispered, my mind racing. But even as I said the words, I knew the odds weren't in our favor. The quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, filling the space with an oppressive weight. I glanced at the clock. Barely a few minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. The fear lingered, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls of the gas station were closing in on us. I tried to think of a plan, but nothing seemed good enough. Every option felt dangerous, like we were balancing on the edge of a knife. Before I could come up with anything, I heard it, the faint rumble of a car pulling up outside. The door chimed again, and my heart sank. For a second, I hoped the sound outside was just another customer. But when the door opened, the two men walked back in, and any hope I had evaporated. This time, they weren't bothering with questions or pretense. The scarred one's gaze locked onto the counter, and it was clear they knew. Victoria tensed behind me, and I felt the weight of her fear pressing down on both of us. My mind raced through useless plans. I thought about blocking the door, lying, anything, but I knew deep down it was too late. The scarred man reached over the counter, his hand dipping behind it like a claw. Before I could react, he yanked Victoria out from her hiding spot. She let out a choked scream, her legs kicking wildly as she fought him, but he barely flinched. The other man moved closer, ready to restrain her, his face twisted with frustration. "Let her go!" I shouted, panic bubbling to the surface. But before I could do anything, a heavy hand shoved me back hard. I stumbled, crashing into the cigarette rack, sending boxes scattering onto the floor. Victoria thrashed and screamed, her voice filling the tiny store with desperate, ragged pleas. She managed to kick one of the men square in the chest, making him stumble. For a moment I thought she might break free, but the scarred man recovered too quickly. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it with brutal efficiency, forcing her to the ground. I struggled to my feet, but by the time I was upright, they had already wrestled her toward the door. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, adding to the surreal weight of the moment. I lunged forward, desperate to stop them, but the wiry man was waiting. He slammed his shoulder into me, and I hit the ground again, gasping for air. Victoria's screams grew louder, more frantic, and her voice cracked with the strain. The sound of her shoes scraping against the tile floor echoed in my mind, mixing with the smell of cheap coffee and motor oil. I scrambled to my knees, adrenaline flooding my body, but they were already dragging her out the door. I stumbled outside just in time to see the two men forcing her into a dark car parked at the edge of the lot. Victoria twisted violently, her arms flailing, but they were stronger, too strong. The sound of the car door slamming shut hit me like a punch to the gut. I sprinted across the asphalt, but the engine roared to life, and the car peeled away, tires squealing as it disappeared into the night. I stopped at the edge of the road, panting and helpless, watching the red taillights fade into the distance. For a moment, I stood there, the silence of the empty highway pressing down on me. The night felt vast and unforgiving, the gas station lights behind me flickering like distant stars. It was as if the world had swallowed Victoria whole, and all that was left was the quiet hum of the universe continuing without us. The parking lot was empty now, the only sound the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. I stood there, my chest heaving, every muscle tense as if the adrenaline still had somewhere to go. But there was nothing I could do. They were gone, and Victoria was with them. I forced myself back inside, grabbing my phone from behind the counter with shaking hands. Calling the authorities was the only thing left to do, but it felt hollow. I knew how these things usually played out. Hours of waiting, questions, and then silence. I made the call, my voice unsteady as I gave them the details. They told me to stay where I was, that someone would be on their way. But the words offered no comfort. The store felt smaller now, suffocating in its emptiness. Life had become predictable, which was just the way I liked it. My days followed a simple rhythm: work, home, occasional outings with a few acquaintances, nothing too complicated. It was a life of stability, free from surprises. I thought I had left the chaotic years of youth behind, those days where everything felt wild and uncertain. Then, Ethan showed up. I was grabbing coffee at a small place downtown, the kind of place I frequented without really thinking. I heard my name called, soft, almost hesitant. I turned, and there he was. Ethan, my best friend from childhood, someone I hadn't seen or thought about in years. He looked older, rougher around the edges, but there was that familiar grin, the one that made me feel like we were still kids sneaking into places we didn't belong. We talked as if no time had passed. He told me he'd been traveling, taking odd jobs here and there. I filled him in on my life. Nothing exciting, just the usual. It felt good to catch up, to slip back into the comfort of an old friendship. There was a warmth in our reunion that I hadn't realized I missed. By the end of that first encounter, it seemed only natural to invite him over. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few days, Ethan started visiting my place. There was something easy about it, as if no time had passed between us. We laughed about old memories, shared a few beers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't just existing, I was living. At the time, I had no reason to think that Ethan's sudden reappearance was anything but a happy accident. The first cracks in the nostalgia appeared almost unnoticed. Ethan's stories about his life since we last saw each other were vague at first, talk of traveling, making money on the side. But as the days went on, his tales became more detailed, more unsettling. He'd mention opportunities he found along the way, ones that didn't sound exactly legal. He laughed as he told me about running packages for people whose names he never asked. At first, I dismissed it. It's easy to brush things off when they're spoken casually, like it was just another part of life. But over time, the stories grew darker. He talked about the people he met, dangerous people, the kind you don't cross. He described situations where he had narrowly escaped trouble, always with a laugh that didn't sit right with me. I began to feel uneasy around Ethan. What bothered me most wasn't just what he was saying, it was the way he said it. As if these things were normal. As if this was his life now, and there was nothing strange about it. A part of me wanted to pull away, to put distance between us. But it's hard to back away from someone who was once like a brother. I told myself that people change, that maybe this was just a phase, but deep down I knew better. Ethan was not the same person I remembered. I tried to create space between us. I started with excuses, work, errands, being too tired. It felt rude, but I needed to protect myself. Something about Ethan didn't sit right with me, and the more he talked, the clearer it became that he was involved in things I wanted no part of. But Ethan was persistent. He didn't seem to notice or care that I was pulling away. He'd show up unannounced at my place, waiting for me to get home. He'd text me late into the night with random messages, some friendly, some strange. When I didn't respond right away, he'd send another, and another. There was a shift in his tone, subtle at first, but unmistakable. The friendly banter began to carry an edge, like he was testing me. One night, he mentioned that I was being distant. He said it lightly, almost jokingly, but the words stuck with me. It was the kind of comment that sounded harmless on the surface, but carried weight beneath it. I started to feel trapped. Ignoring him didn't work. Avoiding him only seemed to make him more determined. I told myself that it would pass, that he would lose interest and move on. But Ethan wasn't going anywhere. Ethan's persistence grew more unsettling by the day. The friendly visits turned into something heavier, something that felt like obligation rather than choice. Every interaction left me more anxious, as if I was waiting for the moment when things would finally fall apart. He started talking about his group, the people he worked with. He didn't ask outright, but there was an implication that he wanted me to get involved. It wasn't an invitation, it was a suggestion, one that didn't leave much room for refusal. "I've got a good thing going," he said once. "Would be easier if you were in." The words lingered long after he left. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a quiet declaration that my options were limited. I knew then that Ethan wouldn't let me walk away easily. The next time he came over, there was a coldness to him that hadn't been there before. He didn't stay long, but as he left, he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Don't go quiet on me, Henry," he said casually. "Would hate to see things go bad between us." It was then that I knew. I wasn't dealing with the Ethan I remembered. This was someone else, someone dangerous, and I had no idea how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted. The pressure from Ethan became unbearable. Every time I saw his name flash on my phone screen, my heart raced. If I ignored him too long, he'd show up at my door, pretending it was a friendly visit, but his presence felt like a threat. He knew where I lived, he knew my routine, and he wasn't shy about reminding me how easily he could disrupt it. I felt cornered, as if my life was no longer my own. Ethan's demands weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. He expected me to get involved, to be a part of whatever network he was tangled in. Every refusal felt like a step towards something worse. I knew he wouldn't let me walk away unscathed. I realized that staying was no longer an option. The life I had built, my job, my home, my routines, was being slowly dismantled by Ethan's presence. There was no way out that didn't involve leaving everything behind. I started planning my escape in secret, moving cautiously so Ethan wouldn't notice. I sold off small possessions to raise cash, taking care not to raise suspicion. I told no one, not even acquaintances, about my intentions. If Ethan got wind of it, I knew he'd act fast to stop me. The night I decided to leave, the weight of my fear was suffocating. I packed quietly, taking only what I could fit into a single bag. I didn't leave a note or make any calls. Disappearing without a trace was my only option. As I zipped the bag shut, the enormity of what I was doing sank in. This wasn't just a move. It was abandonment of my home, my life, my identity. I drove through the night, resisting the urge to look in the rearview mirror. The silence of the empty highway pressed in on me, broken only by the hum of the engine. I kept telling myself that once I reached the new city, everything would be okay. I would blend in, disappear into the crowd, and Ethan would never find me. But the fear didn't leave me. I glanced at my phone, terrified that it might buzz with a message from Ethan. I imagined him waiting for me at a gas station up ahead, as if he knew where I was headed. The paranoia clung to me, even as I crossed the city limits into what I hoped was safety. The new city felt both strange and liberating. I found a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from anyone who knew me. I threw myself into the routine of rebuilding my life, taking on odd jobs to stay afloat. I avoided making new friends. Trusting people seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. But no matter how hard I tried, the fear followed me. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of panic. I kept the curtains closed at night, worried that Ethan might be standing outside, waiting. I checked the locks on my door repeatedly, trying to convince myself that I was safe. The fear gnawed at me, turning everyday moments into sources of anxiety. A knock on the door could make my heart stop. A shadow passing by my window could send me spiraling into panic. I knew I was being irrational, but the fear of Ethan finding me felt too real to ignore. Weeks passed without incident, and I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped Ethan's grasp. The routines of my new life started to feel familiar, even comforting. I let myself believe, if only for brief moments, that I was safe. Then, one afternoon, I found a letter slipped under my door. There was no return address, no stamp, nothing to suggest where it came from. Just my name, written neatly across the front of the envelope. I stared at it, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I debated throwing it away without opening it, but the need to know was too strong. With trembling hands, I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No message, no signature, just a crudely drawn smiley face in the center. I sat there, holding the paper, trying to steady my breathing. There was no way to know if the letter was from Ethan or if it was just a coincidence. I arrived at the apartment building with a sense of cautious optimism, eager for a fresh start. Life had been throwing punches lately. Work stress, personal failures, and an overwhelming sense that I needed to start over somewhere new. The building seemed perfect. Quiet neighborhood, reasonable rent, and a solid, well-kept exterior. The leasing agent had been polite but distant, which suited me just fine. As I walked through the halls with my few belongings, I admired how clean and quiet the place was. It had the kind of silence that promised peace, the kind I'd been chasing for months. My apartment was on the third floor, facing the back alley, which meant no street noise to disturb me. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the feeling of a new beginning. Later that evening, I flipped through the lease agreement one last time. I hadn't read it thoroughly before signing. It was just pages of legal jargon, like any other lease. Most of the rules were standard: no pets, no loud noise after 10 p.m., no unauthorized guests. But then I noticed something odd. A curfew clause. It specifically stated that tenants were not to leave their apartments between 2:17 a.m. and 3:04 a.m. I furrowed my brow, trying to make sense of it. Who makes a rule like that? I figured it was probably the result of some paranoid landlord worried about security or liability. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off. I was too tired to care about quirky rules. After all, the rent was affordable and the place was perfect otherwise. Over the next few days, I settled into a comfortable routine. The neighbors were quiet and kept to themselves, almost too quiet now that I thought about it. I hardly saw anyone in the halls or the elevators. Even the building staff seemed invisible, appearing only when absolutely necessary. But I didn't mind. I wasn't here to make friends. Then the messages started. At first, I received emails from the building management, reminding me of the lease terms. They were formal, almost robotic, listing the rules like a checklist. But soon, the messages became more frequent and more intrusive. Some came late at night, urging me to follow the curfew. One text warned, "Remember, 2:17 to 3:04 a.m. Compliance is expected." I stared at the message, feeling a chill run down my spine. I tried to trace the number, but it was unlisted. It was around this time that I met Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who lived a few doors down. She seemed sweet at first, offering a polite smile as we crossed paths in the hallway. One day she stopped me just before I entered my apartment. "You read the lease, didn't you?" she asked, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. I nodded, unsure where she was going with the question. "You follow those rules," she said, lowering her voice to a whisper, "for your own good." Her words left me uneasy. There was no humor in her tone, only a quiet seriousness that made me question everything about this place. One night, insomnia got the better of me. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the restless feeling gnawing at my chest. The clock read 2:20 a.m., but I had forgotten all about the curfew clause. I figured a walk down the hall might clear my mind, so I threw on some clothes and stepped out of my apartment. The hallway felt different at night. The air was thicker, the silence more oppressive. A low hum seemed to vibrate through the walls, and though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. As I wandered down the corridor, a faint noise caught my attention. It was coming from one of the apartments. muted voices as if people were having a hushed conversation. Curiosity got the best of me, and I moved closer. Through the door, I could hear fragments of their conversation. They were talking about the building's owner, something about crimes and secret dealings. My heart pounded in my chest. The voices carried a weight that felt dangerous, like I was overhearing something I shouldn't. Just as I turned to head back to my apartment, movement at the far end of the hall stopped me cold. Two figures in black cloaks appeared, dragging a large, heavy bag between them. They moved with unsettling ease, as if they'd done this 100 times before. For a moment, I stood frozen, hoping they wouldn't notice me. One of them glanced in my direction, but they didn't stop. They continued down the corridor, disappearing into the stairwell without a sound. I rushed back to my apartment, heart racing, and locked the door behind me. It was only then that I remembered the curfew rule, and realized I had broken it. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was a dream or some strange hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But the fear in my chest refused to fade. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another message from the building management. It came sooner than I expected. At exactly 8 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my door. I opened it to find one of the building's employees standing there, a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a pressed uniform. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried a warning. "You were out of your apartment last night," he said flatly. I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't sleep," I stammered, trying to sound casual. The man didn't blink. "That's not an excuse. The rules exist for a reason. Don't break them again." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, heart pounding. The warning wasn't just a reprimand, it felt like a threat. Whatever I had seen last night wasn't meant for me to witness. As I closed the door, the walls of the apartment seemed to close in around me. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with strange rules. There was something sinister woven into the very fabric of this building, something that went far beyond a mere lease agreement. The days that followed were heavy with tension. I tried to go about my routine, but the fear clung to me like a second skin. Every little sound made me jump, a creak in the ceiling, a door clicking shut somewhere down the hall. I became hyper-aware of my neighbors. They seemed to watch me in subtle ways, curtains shifting when I passed windows, doors cracked just enough for someone to peek out as I walked by. The automated messages kept coming. Each one carried the same sterile tone, reminding me to follow the lease terms. The curfew was always mentioned, almost as if daring me to break it again. Mrs. Callahan gave me another one of her warnings during a chance encounter in the lobby. She leaned in close, her voice trembling as she said, "They don't like rule breakers. Be careful or you won't last long here." Her words gnawed at me. I tried to piece together what I had witnessed that night. The cloaked figures, the whispered conversations about crimes, the reprimand the next morning. The pieces fit together too neatly to be a coincidence, but I had no way of knowing what it all meant. All I knew was that I had to get out. I knew I couldn't stay. The fear wasn't just in my head, it was real, pressing, suffocating. I started packing my things bit by bit, careful not to draw attention to what I was doing. I didn't know how closely I was being watched, but I wasn't going to take any chances. Every time I left my apartment, I felt eyes on me. The neighbors who once seemed indifferent now felt like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. I couldn't tell if they were trying to protect me or if they were part of whatever was happening here. I made a plan to leave without telling anyone. I wouldn't inform the building management, I'd just disappear. But the closer I got to my escape, the more paranoid I became. I imagined the building employees intercepting me before I could make it to the door, dragging me back inside to enforce the rules I had broken. Even the simple act of packing felt dangerous. Every item I placed in my bag felt like a countdown towards something inevitable. I wasn't just leaving an apartment. I was running for my life. The night of my planned escape, I barely slept. My bag sat by the door, ready to go. I waited until the early hours of the morning, knowing the building would be at its quietest. I told myself to stay calm, but my hands shook as I put on my coat. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt thick with anticipation. The elevator was just a few feet away, but the walk toward it felt endless. Every step echoed down the corridor, amplifying my fear that someone would hear me. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart raced as I glanced over my shoulder, but the corridor behind me was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, steady as a heartbeat. I reached the elevator and punched the button repeatedly, willing the doors to open. The sound of a door creaking open somewhere down the hall made my skin crawl. Someone was watching. I could feel it. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, my pulse thundering in my ears. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the corridor, a figure standing still, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the apartment. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city and collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to think. I had made it out. I was free. Or so I thought. The next few days were uneasy. I stayed in the motel, afraid to go back to my normal life. Even though I had left the apartment behind, the fear remained. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be another message from the building management. Every knock on the door made my stomach twist in knots. Then, the message arrived. It was an email from an unknown sender, and the subject line read, "We noticed your absence." I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. The message was short, just a single sentence. "We hope you reconsider." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. It was clear now. Leaving the building hadn't freed me. Whatever I had escaped from was still watching, still waiting. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, knowing deep down that the rules had followed me. Some places don't just let you leave, and some shadows never stop hunting. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. I had no plans, no expectations. Just me, coffee, and the usual quiet routine of my life. But that changed the moment I opened my front door and saw the package sitting there. Plain, brown, and completely unmarked. No return address, no delivery slip, not even a name. At first I thought it might be a mistake. Maybe it was for a neighbor or some kind of junk mail. But my curiosity got the better of me. I carried the box inside and sat down at the kitchen table to open it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I expected some sort of note, but when I opened it, all I found was a list of names. Some were crossed out, others were not. It was neat, the kind of list someone might keep as a personal record. But I didn't recognize any of the names, and the randomness of it made my skin crawl. I stared at the list for a while, waiting for it to make sense. Was this some kind of prank? Had someone dropped it off at the wrong house? Or was it something worse, something I wasn't ready to understand? The whole thing unsettled me more than it should have. I folded the list back up, crumpled it, and threw it into the trash. Whatever this was, it wasn't my problem. I told myself not to think about it. But even as I tried to distract myself with chores and TV, the image of the names stayed lodged in the back of my mind. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. I couldn't shake the weird feeling that had settled in my chest since finding the package. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off. A few hours later, I woke with a start, heart pounding in my chest. Something had disturbed me, but I wasn't sure what. I sat up in bed, listening to the silence of the house, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Then I heard it, a faint knock at one of the windows. The sound was deliberate, soft but distinct. I froze, straining to hear more. A few moments passed, and then came another sound, a soft scrape at the front door, like something dragging across the wood. I threw off the blankets and crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing. No one was there. Just the porch, bathed in dim moonlight and the eerie stillness of the night. I told myself it was just the wind, a stray branch brushing against the house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something felt off. Still, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went back to bed. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Nothing more. The next morning, the unease still hadn't left me. I went outside to take the trash bins to the curb, hoping a bit of fresh air might clear my mind. But when I stepped into the yard, I stopped cold. The trash I had thrown out the previous day, including the crumpled list, was scattered all over the lawn. Someone had dragged everything back out, emptying the contents onto the grass like a twisted reminder of what I had discarded. At first I thought it might be an animal, but as I walked closer, I saw footprints pressed into the dirt. Human footprints, messy and erratic, as if whoever had left them was in a hurry or drunk. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking nearby, watching me. But the street was empty, the neighborhood quiet as usual. I gathered the trash as quickly as I could, stuffing it back into the bins. My hands shook as I handled the paper with the names on it. For a moment, I considered keeping it, trying to figure out what it all meant. But instead, I shoved it back into the trash, determined to put it out of my mind. As I hauled the bins to the curb, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from a distance, waiting to see what I'd do next. That night, I made sure every window and door was locked before going to bed. I left the porch light on, hoping it might deter whoever had been snooping around. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and groan of the walls sent a jolt of anxiety through me. It felt like the house was alive, conspiring with whatever was outside, waiting for me to let my guard down. Around midnight, the noises started again. A knock at the window, louder this time. The scrape of something sharp against the front door, dragging slowly as if to taunt me. I could hear faint footsteps outside, circling the house. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just some neighborhood kids playing a prank. But the rational part of my mind knew better. This wasn't a prank. I got out of bed and moved toward the window, careful not to make any noise. Peeking through the curtain, I saw nothing but darkness. No figures, no movement, just the faint glow of the porch light illuminating an empty lawn. Still, the noises continued. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. I checked my phone, half expecting to see a message from some unknown number, but the screen was blank. The silence was almost worse than the sounds, like whoever was out there wanted me to feel alone, isolated. As the hours dragged on, the noises eventually stopped, leaving the house in suffocating silence once again. But sleep was impossible. I sat by the window until dawn, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that whoever, or whatever, was out there hadn't left for good. The following night, I decided I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Something was coming for me, or at least trying to, and pretending otherwise wasn't going to keep me safe. I kept every light in the house on, hoping it would scare away whoever was stalking me. I stayed near the front door, phone in hand, ready to call for help if needed. The noises began earlier this time, around midnight. The familiar knocks tapped at the windows, soft and deliberate, followed by the faint scrape at the door. But this time, it didn't stop. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch, right outside my front door. I held my breath as the doorknob began to rattle violently. Whoever was out there wasn't just trying to scare me, they were trying to get inside. The door shook in its frame as they pulled and twisted the handle. My hands trembled as I backed away, keeping my eyes locked on the door. For a moment it felt like the door would burst open. The frame groaned under the pressure, the sound of wood straining against metal hinges. I was frozen, too scared to move, waiting for the inevitable moment when the lock would give way. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The rattling ceased, the footsteps retreated, and the house fell into silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, heart racing, listening to the fading sound of footsteps as they disappeared into the night. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night in that house. The fear had taken hold of me, and the thought of what might happen if I stayed was too overwhelming to ignore. I packed a small bag with essentials, not bothering with anything that would slow me down. I kept the blinds closed, peeking out occasionally to see if anyone was watching. Paranoia had taken root in my mind. Every parked car, every flicker of movement in the street felt like a threat. As I loaded my bag into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. My skin prickled with unease, and I felt like I was being hunted, like the house itself was waiting to punish me for trying to leave. I didn't care. I had to get out. Staying wasn't an option anymore. The drive away from the house felt surreal. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The road stretched ahead of me in eerie silence, broken only by the hum of the engine. Every mile I put between myself and that house felt like a small victory. But relief didn't come. My mind raced, replaying the events of the past nights. The package, the noises, the attack on the door. It all felt connected, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. When I reached my new location, a small rental on the outskirts of town, I let out a shaky breath. The house was behind me now, and with it, the strange events that had turned my life upside down. At least that's what I told myself. For the first few days in my new place, I tried to convince myself that the nightmare was over. I avoided looking at my phone, afraid that another message might appear. I kept the windows closed, the doors locked, and I didn't tell anyone where I had gone. The car sputtered once, then again, before the engine died completely. I cursed under my breath, gripping the steering wheel as my vehicle rolled to a stop on the remote road. I sat there in stunned silence, listening to the hum of insects outside and the faint rustling of wind through the trees. There was no engine noise, no headlights approaching, just me, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Pulling out my phone, I checked for service, but the screen displayed the dreaded "no signal." I scrolled through my apps in desperation, hoping something would connect, but there was nothing. The road ahead stretched endlessly into the night, and the only light came from the stars and the sliver of a pale moon overhead. Behind me, the empty asphalt faded into darkness, making it clear how far I was from any kind of help. I leaned back against the headrest, exhaling slowly. My options were slim. Either stay here and hope someone came along or start walking, though the nearest town had to be miles away. Just as I was beginning to seriously consider the possibility of spending the night in the car, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me. Someone was coming. I jumped out of the car and waved my arms, signaling the approaching vehicle. The car slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. A man leaned out from the driver's window, flashing a friendly smile. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice warm and casual. "Yeah," I said, feeling a bit awkward but grateful. "My car broke down, no signal. I'd appreciate a lift to the nearest town." "Hop in," the man said. "Name's Anthony." "Alexander," I replied, climbing into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of leather and pine-scented air freshener, and Anthony looked like the kind of guy who was always eager to lend a hand. His relaxed demeanor put me at ease as we started down the road. The night stretched on around us as we drove in companionable silence. The road remained eerily empty, with no other cars passing in either direction. I figured we had a while before we'd hit town, but the sense of relief from having someone with me kept me from worrying. After a few miles, Anthony glanced my way with a grin. "There's a bar coming up soon. Decent place. We could take a break, grab a quick drink." I hesitated for only a moment. The idea of resting for a bit, maybe even stretching my legs, sounded good. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" The bar came into view just as Anthony had said, a small, run-down building on the side of the road. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, and only a couple of cars were parked outside. It wasn't exactly inviting, but after the night I'd had, I wasn't in the mood to be picky. We stepped inside, the door creaking as it swung open. The interior was dimly lit, with dust-covered tables and a bar that had clearly seen better days. A handful of patrons sat scattered across the room, keeping to themselves. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like everyone there was avoiding conversation. "I'll be right back," Anthony said, giving me a nod before heading toward the restroom at the back of the bar. I watched him go, then sat down at the bar and ordered a drink, hoping it might help me unwind. Minutes ticked by, and I found myself glancing toward the restroom door, waiting for Anthony to return. The bartender cleaned glasses silently, casting the occasional glance in my direction, but the room remained eerily still. After waiting a little longer, I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. I left my drink untouched on the bar and stood up, heading toward the restroom to check on Anthony. But when I got there, the room was empty, no sign of him. Confused, I walked back through the bar, scanning the tables and booths. There was no trace of Anthony anywhere. It was as if he had vanished. I approached the bartender, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, you didn't see where the guy I came with went, did you?" The bartender gave me a bored look and shrugged. "Didn't see anyone leave. Maybe he just slipped out." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. Anthony had been friendly, helpful. Why would he just leave without saying anything? The longer I stood there, the heavier the unease became. Something about this place, this night, felt off. I couldn't tell if Anthony had abandoned me or if something worse was going on, but one thing was certain. I was now alone again, in a bar full of strangers. And that was when the door creaked open and a group of men walked in, their eyes locking onto mine immediately. The moment the men stepped inside, the atmosphere in the bar shifted. They weren't just passing through, they were here with purpose. Their eyes locked onto me as if they had been expecting someone like me to show up. They spread out, surrounding me casually but deliberately. The tallest of the group leaned in with a smirk, his voice low and mocking. "You lost, friend?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just waiting on someone." The men exchanged glances, as if they found my response amusing. "Oh, I think your friend's long gone," one of them chuckled. "Seems like you're all alone now." A knot of fear tightened in my chest. I glanced toward the door, calculating my odds of making it out of the bar if things went bad. But they must have seen it on my face. One of them stepped closer, blocking my way. "Let's make this easy," the tall man said, his smile sharp. "Why don't you hand over whatever cash you've got? No need to make a fuss." I hesitated, weighing my options. Outnumbered and cornered, I had no choice. Slowly, I pulled out my wallet and handed over the little cash I had left. The men laughed, their voices dripping with mockery as they pocketed the money. "Thanks, friend," one of them sneered. "Welcome to the neighborhood." With that, they turned and left, their laughter trailing behind them as they disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, stunned, wondering how the night had taken such a strange and sudden turn. I stepped outside into the cold night air, shivering as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and silent. The bar's dim neon sign flickered weakly behind me, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Anthony was gone. The friendly man who had offered me a ride had vanished without a trace, leaving me stranded and penniless. Had it all been a setup? Had he abandoned me on purpose? Or had something happened to him that I couldn't understand? The questions swirled in my mind, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to find a way back to town. There was no point in waiting for another strange encounter inside that bar. I walked down the road, hoping that another car would pass by before the night grew any colder. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal, made me jump. The isolation felt more oppressive now, the darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stay warm as I waited by the roadside. After what felt like hours, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly approaching along the empty road. Desperation made me bold, and I stepped into the road, waving my arms. The car slowed to a stop, and the driver, a kindly older man, rolled down the window. "Need a ride, son?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yeah," I said, relieved. "Just trying to get back to town." He nodded, motioning for me to hop in. I climbed into the passenger seat, grateful for the warmth of the car's heater. The older man didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. The night's events replayed in my mind as we drove in silence. Anthony's sudden disappearance, the men at the bar, the strange series of events that had left me stranded. It all felt unreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. By the time we reached the town's outskirts, I felt numb, the adrenaline from earlier finally wearing off. The older man dropped me off near the town's small motel, giving me a reassuring pat on the shoulder before driving away into the night. I stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear, feeling an odd sense of detachment. I had made it back safely, but the strange night lingered in my thoughts like a puzzle with missing pieces.